Hey y'all, it's K-Bird Tweets, and this is Peace, Love, and Baseball. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Peace, Love, and Baseball. I am your host, K-Bird Tweets. You can follow me on Twitter there at K-Bird, B-U-R-D, Tweets. Maybe you're watching on the K-Bird Tweets YouTube channel, and Peace, Love, and Baseball is available wherever you get your podcast. So first and foremost, want to make sure that you're subscribed. You hit that like button if you're enjoying it. Leave a comment, join in on the conversation, and wanted to pop on and just give you a quick intro before we get into our New York Mets feature with Sam and Ashley of the Why Am I a Mets Fan podcast, because as you may know, I am in the process of moving from Chicago to the greater Philadelphia area. This episode is coming out on Tuesday, June 4th, and you know I am very diligent with my new weekly Tuesday episodes, but since I am going to be making this move halfway across the country, next week on Tuesday, June 11th, there will not be a new episode for you. We will also take the week off from our weekly Cardinals coverage and gonna be coming back at you then the next week. Sunday, June 16th, we'll hit up some Cardinals, get caught up there. And then Tuesday, June 18th, we'll get back at it with a new, fresh episode of Peace, Love, and Baseball. I appreciate you being here, sticking with me even with the week off, and we're going to get into lots of good stuff with Sam and Ashley today to learn all about the New York Mets culture and fandom, talk a lot about the state of the franchise currently as well. I have linked all of the information to their show and where you can follow them in the show notes. So make sure that you hit that up as well. And along with that in the show notes, I'm going to put a couple episodes that I put out around this time last year when I got to attend the London series, and we're coming up on the Mets traveling to London this coming weekend for the London series. I did an episode last year with my sister and her boyfriend, who is from the UK. And my sister's been living over there for about 5 years now, to preview the London series, just kind of get a bit of background on the UK culture and how baseball would fit into it there. And then I did a recap episode as well. So if you're getting amped for that, or if you're attending maybe for the first time yourself, you can listen into that. And of course, it is referring to last year's series against the Cubs and the Cardinals, but lots of good stuff that is going to play into this year's London series as well. All right. Well, for today, let's get over to our interview with Sam and Ashley. And I look forward to connecting with you again when I am over on the East Coast. Welcome back to Peace, Love, and Baseball. It is New York Mets week here, and I am fortunate enough to be joined by Sam and Ashley of the Why Am I a Mets Fan podcast. Sam and Ashley are sports anchors and reporters for CNY Central in Syracuse, New York, and they have recently launched this new podcast. So super excited to talk to them, not only about that, but to get into their lifelong Mets fandom. How is it going today?
It is going great. Again, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. And yeah, I'm sure this will come out, but I think the name of the podcast is definitely a little hint into the way that Ashley and I have felt our entire lives.
Yeah, it's been a rough stretch for the Mets lately, but, tough time to launch a Mets podcast is what everyone's been saying to us. We just got started about 3 weeks ago, but yeah, thank you so much for having us on. We're so excited.
Sometimes those tough times can be the best times, though, because Mets fans, sports fans are always looking for solidarity, and the real fans, we're not going to quit on our team when times get tough. So they're looking for people just like you. Sam, tell me how you came to start the podcast, because you've been a lifelong Mets fan. Is that right?
Yeah. We're both lifers, and unfortunately it was passed down from generations. So we're grandfathered into this. Actually we have to give a little credit to our boss here at CNY Central, Sean Carroll. He's really the one who he's a Phillies fan, but he actually is the one who really sort of ultimately thought of this idea. And he brought it to us both working here, being friends off the air and loving the Mets. We felt like it was a really unique opportunity to be able to not only give our perspective about how we feel as Mets fans, But being in Syracuse, we felt like, well, listen, there are a lot of Mets podcasts for sure, but there are probably not a lot of Mets podcasts that are really focused on the future. So we wanted to kind of go at it from the lens of, if you're a Mets fan, these are the Syracuse players who you should keep your eye on. And of course, we talk about the big club too.
Yeah, it's perfect in a sense because we get out, we joke it's like our therapy every week to vent about the Mets and the biggest topics that people are talking about on Twitter and social media. But like Sam mentioned, having that Syracuse connection with the AAA team right here and, you know, working at a TV station and having that access to talk to the players and whatnot, I think is what makes us unique and what brings a little bit of a different perspective.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Ashley, when I listened to, I think it was your first episode, you mentioned that you were such a hardcore baseball fan that you had a fantasy team by the time that you were 8 years old. And I played that so hard because that was right around the same age that I created my own scorebook. That was nothing like an actual legitimate scorebook, but I just felt like I needed to be that immersed in it. And it's been that way ever since. And I think that's a really great perspective to have, you being there in Syracuse, especially around a club that year over year has not yet found kind of their stride and the consistent success. So it absolutely is another great perspective for fans to just be more invested in kind of a positive headspace, along with, airing your grievances throughout the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it is unique, right? I think it's worth bringing up. I mean, we're all females. I haven't seen another Mets podcast that is two women. So we're excited to really get into that as well. And yeah, I think it's just one of those things where it's a perfect opportunity, right? All the cards fell into place and we're excited.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because a lot of times I feel like, do I have to point out the fact that we're women? Well, we do, because it is different. And one of the things that I find interesting when I think about like what my ideal role is in sports media, or specifically in the baseball world, since that's my true love, is that I don't necessarily see a lot of women, even though they're in sports media, doing it kind of the way that you guys are doing it, and really sharing your opinions and saying, like, just because I haven't played professional baseball doesn't mean that I don't bring, a perspective that's worth listening to, because the majority of people, even if they are men in the sports media, haven't necessarily played either. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, that I'll just take one beat on that, because I do think that is funny. You're so right. It's like most people who are talking about baseball haven't played professionally, right? And at least for me, I won't speak for Ashley, but I think this is a unique opportunity because yes, we're both women, but we also want to sort of break out into some different roles that you might not even see from us in our normal day jobs, nevertheless in sports media. So much of sports media compared to our job, which we do here, is opinionated. That's a lot of what this is. It's sports talk. We want to be ourselves and be able to be emotional and be funny and take risks. And this gives us a chance to do that. So hopefully in other people seeing that, and I have to say, I think the feedback actually has been really great. I mean, the comments that we're getting, we're appreciating the fact that people are just very open to our insight and just hearing what we have to say. So hopefully it inspires more women to just continue to be in the field and give their opinions, because that's really what we want. We just want to make it better.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say that, like, going off of what you said, I think there are women now who are sports anchors and sports reporters, and there's a lot more women in the sports media space than, even 10, 15 years ago. But like Sam mentioned, that sports talk, I feel like, is still so underrepresented for women. And it's something, at least I know, that I crave in our regular jobs. Like, even we cover Syracuse University very closely. Like, I crave that more of a creative sports talk space. So we're excited to do that here.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, you are doing it. I was so excited when I came across it was just suggested to me on YouTube, obviously right up my alley. And I was just so excited to see not only two women talking about it, but the way you're talking about it. And just, I think you said something along the lines of like, they're on a 4-game winning streak wearing the City Connects. I'm like, these are the kinds of things that I want to talk about. So I think the way you talk about baseball is so relatable to so many fans, and it's pure entertainment as well as, hard coverage of the sport. But we are here today to talk about your team, the New York Mets, and give our listeners a bit of insight into the franchise, which is not one of the oldest franchises. And I think that's something that's maybe easy to forget, because it seems like they've just been around forever and they're in New York. They have a huge fan base. But let me give us just a little background on the founding of the franchise, and then we'll dive into the fandom a little bit more. So after the 1957 season, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants relocated from New York to California, which we've covered in our Dodgers episode, to become the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants. They left the largest city in the United States with no National League franchise and just one major league team, that being the New York Yankees of the American League. With the threat of a New York team joining the Continental League at the time, the National League expanded by adding the New York Mets following a proposal from William Shea, which is a name that all Mets fans and probably all baseball fans are at least somewhat familiar with. And this is something that I learned when I did my Dodgers episode, but the new team took its primary colors, the blue of the Dodgers and the orange of the Giants, both of which are colors that are also featured on the flag of New York City. Their official name is the New York Metropolitan Baseball Club. It is a nod to the Metropolitans, which were a New York team in the American Association in the 1880s, but they are obviously called the Mets, and that's a lot easier to say and to write in headlines and all that good stuff. But I want to ask you, what is the most common backstory for Mets fans? Were most of them Brooklyn Dodgers fans?
I think the answer to that ultimately is yes. You mentioned it, but I always think that is such an interesting part of it. The fact that they're taking the colors from the Dodgers and the Giants, which in my opinion is just great marketing, right?
Yeah.
Like you're bringing those two colors together. And I think that made people crave and want the experience of being there. I think the National League was a part of it. People wanted to continue to follow a team in the National League. And the truth of the matter is that most people who were rooting for, I think, the Dodgers or the Giants were not in a place where they were willing to become Yankees fans. And like most people didn't want to do that. It's a totally different fan base. The way that I've always kind of viewed it is I kind of think that Mets really attracted more of a blue collar worker, whereas the Yankees were sort of more of a white collar team. Mm-hmm. So I think that the people who had rooted for those two teams previously were looking for something new and looking for something different. And many of them, they were attracted to the Mets once they saw what the Mets kind of stood for.
I completely agree with you. That's actually exactly what I was thinking in my head. The Mets have always attracted more of the blue collar New York crowd. I mean, we always say it, right? But it's easy to be a Yankees fan. They win all the time. And I think the fan base back in those days, like you're talking about, when the Dodgers and the Giants left for the West Coast, the fans that identified with the Mets just simply were never going to identify with the Yankees. It's more of that gritty underdog in the outer boroughs, people from Queens, people from Staten Island, Long Island. So I think that the two fan bases really just are very different in terms of their backgrounds. And then I think that carries over to today, right? We're both Mets fans because of our family, and we were raised and it was passed down through generations. And I think that's a common story from people from the New York area or from the tri-state area.
Very cool. Yeah, I agree. They clearly have very different vibes, but you articulated that very well for us. So just a little snapshot of kind of the early days of the Mets. On April 11th of 1962, the Mets played their first official game in history. They played the St. Louis Cardinals for their first game ever. So I know I shared with you that I'm a Cardinals fan. We've got a lot of Cardinals fans listening as well. But it was a loss. They lost to the Cardinals 11-4. And I feel like this kind of these next few things I'm going to share kind of lay the groundwork for like the challenges that the Mets, it just kind of set the tone right off the bat here that they were not going to have it easy, and they are always going to be kind of working from the ground up as this blue collar team in New York City. So April 13th, the Mets opened their first of their two seasons at the Polo Grounds. They lost to the Pirates 4-3 in the first NL game played in New York City since 1957. April 23rd, the Mets secured their first victory in franchise history over Pittsburgh. And by September of 1963, they played their final game at the Polo Grounds, losing 5-1 before only 1,752 fans. But here's the crazy thing. By opening day at Shea Stadium on April 17th in 1964, it was a 4-3 loss to the Pirates, but there were 48,736 fans there. So you mentioned how A lot of the fans of the Mets were just people who were never going to be fans of the Yankees, and that's kind of how it's gotten passed down. So despite being a much younger and less winning team than the Yankees, it does seem like the Mets have a large and steadfast fan base. How do Mets fans feel? Like, how do they feel about the Yankees, and what is that rivalry like?
This is something we actually touched on in our first episode as well. I think it depends on, Sam is from Long Island. I'm from New Jersey originally. I think it sort of does depend on your background in terms of how you feel about the Yankees. For me, it was the Yankees are hated in my family. So, Subway Series, the rivalry, the whole thing. We kind of ranked the Mets rivalries, and I think the Mets presently have some bigger rivals in terms of the Braves and the Phillies within the division. They matter a little more, year to year, game to game. But the Yankees are just always going to be that Subway Series. Just always has that extra juice. Brings people out to the Bronx or to Queens. And even if both teams are out of it or one of the teams is out of it, it's just such an energized series that just really does mean more, I would say, to all fans.
It absolutely does mean more. And I think it's interesting. I don't know what the percentages would be on this. I'd be curious to find out. My truth is I think that a lot of Mets fans hate the Yankees, and I think a lot of Yankees fans couldn't really care less about the Mets.
Sure.
I think there's like a little brother kind of syndrome there. And I'm honest enough to say that. I think if you're a Mets fan, you're looking up kind of at Big Brother Yankees. They've won 27 titles. The Mets have won 2. There are a lot of times where if you're a Mets fan, you're on the outside looking in, watching the Yankees succeed. There have been just so many, playoff runs in postseason baseball where you have to, I guess, I think a little jealous. I'm just being honest. I really think that's kind of where it comes from. But I do think that it means more to the city. And I think that it actually, in a way, like that rivalry and that feeling, to me, is just another part of the storyline. Because to Ashley's point, I mean, honestly, I don't even know if I've ever even been to Yankee Stadium, but I think I feel pretty uncomfortable. Like, I don't think there's a version where I'm ever even putting on a Yankees hat, even just as like a fan, because I think it would just feel right. It wouldn't feel right. I don't know.
I went to the Subway Series last year at Yankee Stadium because I want to go to every ballpark, and I hadn't been there, and it was the closest one. So that was fine because they were playing the Mets. But yeah, just such a fun atmosphere and a fun environment. And I think it just, within New York, like you're saying, there is a little bit of the little brother syndrome, right, for the Mets. But I think it's so good for the city, those rare years when both teams are good. And I just know personally, growing up there, I love the comparisons. Mm-hmm. My dad would buy the New York Post, and I would religiously read the sports section from the time I was a little kid. And my favorite edition of it would be the first Subway Series in June or July. They would come out and they would do a comparison position by position of each. So they'd compare, David Wright and whoever was playing third base for the Yankees, those positional comparisons. And I just love them because even as a Mets fan, right, the ones you'd win, you'd be like, oh, like they think that, so-and-so is better than the Yankees catcher or whatever. So, yeah, it's just a fun rivalry, even if it's not always a rivalry, I guess, per se.
Well, and who doesn't want to see the underdog do well every once in a while, right? Like, come on. I think even some Yankees fans have got to be tired of the Yankees just always winning, especially the way that they always win. But yeah, so we can all pull for the Mets in some regard from that angle. Well, in the very early days of the franchise in 1964, the premiere of Mr. Met, who is still the mascot to this day, came about very early on. Mr. Met, he's a pretty popular guy?
Yep, Mr. Met, and of course Mrs. Met, the newest edition. I don't know. I had like such a kick out of that. Like, I don't know who thought of that idea, but they just need a raise. Like the fact that it's both of them now. Yes, I would say a very popular mascot, to the point where we've even like used him for promotion for this podcast. We have an intern who lives on Long Island. And he would like ask Mr. Met to hold up our podcast thing, and Mr. Met said yes, which was also sort of surprising. Very popular guy.
Okay, we love Mr. Met and Mrs. Met. When did Mrs. Met come around? Is that more recently?
Definitely. I mean, that's been, I think, in the past few years, right?
Yeah, maybe 5 to 10 years. I don't know, so don't quote us on that. But there was no Mrs. Met, or in the early days.
Yeah, she's new.
representing. I love it. Well, it didn't take the Mets long to find some better times. By April 2nd of 1966, they won a special lottery for the rights to USC pitcher Tom Seaver. April 17th of 1968, they win a home opener for the first time ever in front of 52,000 fans as Jerry Koosman shut out the Giants 3-0. In 1969, they would clinch their first NL East pennant behind Gary Gentry's 6-0 shutout of the St. Louis Cardinals, and they beat the Braves in the championship series. They went on to beat the Orioles for their first World Series title in their first 10 years as a franchise, which is pretty awesome. In 1973, they would make it back to the World Series after beating the Reds in the championship series, but they ultimately fell to the A's in the World Series. Now, in 1977, Tom Seaver is traded and the Mets fall into last place for several years to come. Tom Seaver is kind of the first, I think, of notable players that come up in Mets history, but there have been many for the Mets over the years. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Keith Hernandez in a bit, but baseball fans will be familiar with names like Darryl Strawberry, Mike Piazza, Carlos Beltran. Who is, Ashley, the most impactful Mets player in your fandom?
Well, we're young. So that's the disclaimer I like to put on this. I'm 23, Sam is 26. So we really grew up on those early 2000s teams, even into like 2010, 2012, I would say is really when we started to be old enough to really, really care about the Mets. So my answer is easy. It was David Wright. He was the guy back then. I felt like in love. Well, that doesn't sound right, but I love to watch David Wright before I like loved the Mets, if that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah.
When my dad was trying to get me into the Mets, it was like I really latched on to David Wright, and then of course Jose Reyes anchoring that side of the infield.
I was gonna say.
You were gonna say Jose Reyes?
Yeah, I've had it written down on my paper.
They were my favorites. They were the best back then, and then that transitioned as we got a little bit older into, I would say, the pitching core of Matt Harvey and Zach Wheeler and Noah Syndergaard. But yeah, it was David Wright to start.
Yeah, I mean, going up, I had it written down. I was going to say Jose Reyes. And for me, a part of that was because, obviously there were certain things about his play that you could see that were exciting. His speed, his defense, he was flashy. But to me, Jose Reyes had an intangible, which was that he was cool. Like, he was just cool. And I think he appealed to a younger audience, which I still to this day believe that that's what baseball needs. Mm-hmm. They need some younger fans, and I feel like Jose Reyes kind of catered to that generation of people who wanted to see someone who was a little more flashy and who contributed to the team culture. And I'm a little biased right now because that's something we're aching for, and we've talked about it frequently over the course of the past few weeks. But I think about someone like Reyes, and I think the Mets team that we're seeing right now could really use a juice guy, a glue guy like that. And they have Lindor, who I think is kind of similar, honestly. But that's somebody who I really feel like, man, that energy is sort of missed around here.
Do you remember when Jose Reyes and David Wright did that GQ shoot in like 2007 or 2008? I just remember looking at the pictures from that, and I was like, these guys are so cool. Like we're talking about, the Mets don't often own New York, but like that era of Reyes and Wright and Carlos Beltran and some of those other characters, they own New York a little bit.
Yeah, it's true. It's like Reyes was the kind of player who he sold jerseys. Yeah. He sold people on the Mets. Like he made it a different franchise because he made baseball cool. So I'm always interested, I feel like, in players like that. I'm drawn to players like that.
Oh, for sure. Me too. We talk a lot about vibes here on Peace, Love, and Baseball and the personalities that we just want to see more and more of. And Major League Baseball still has a lot of opportunity to expand on that from all of the teams and just the way that the teams are covered. Well, this kind of sets up my next question perfectly, because I love to ask this because I think it just gives good insight into kind of the culture of the team or what fans want to see out of the team. So, Sam, if you could pick any current Major League Baseball player that has never played for the Mets, that should be a Met, doesn't have to fill a need for the team or, be realistic at all, just based on culture fit, like who do you want to see be that juice guy for the Mets?
I have that. Do you have an answer in your head? I'm just curious. Don't say it. I
have a baseball answer. Mine's not really based around culture. It's based around like baseball.
Okay. I was just curious if it's going to be the same one. I said this to Ashley yesterday. I want Juan Soto. Come on.
That's what I was
that's what I was going to say. I was going to go 3-2-1 because I knew you were going to say that. But honestly, just because, listen, of course, you always want to I think as a Mets fan, you're just like, hey, if we could grab a player from the Yankees, like that always feels good selfishly. But also, obviously right now he's on a 1-year contract there. Uncle Stevie can certainly afford him. And just, I mean, even yesterday, I think the reason why it came up is because we were watching him just crush the ball, crush home runs. And we were in the sports office and I was just like, Ashley, I really wish that the Mets had Soto. And of course, mind you, what would happen in a situation like that is that he would come to the Mets and then he would start batting 225 because that's just how it goes. But I think we could really use somebody like him right now. We need somebody who, again, like that juice guy who's just a really talented player, who's a little bit younger. I think those kinds of things are important right now. I'm sure a lot of Mets fans who listen to this know this, but maybe even all of baseball, that obviously right now the Mets are pretty much that like veteran-led team. I'm sure we'll get into this more, but it's ultimately the worst of both worlds because they are veteran-led and they have that core, but they're not a win-now team because they're not winning. They're a lose-now team. So one like Juan Soto, I think could potentially change something like that around.
Yeah, I agree. I think Soto's young. He's fun. You said it. That's good for the game right now. It gets fans in the seats. It gets viewers watching the games. I think for me, his youth is the biggest part of it, right? He's one of the best players in baseball. He's so good. And I think he's 24 or 25. Young. He's so young. So I would love to see the Mets sign him. And then in a more general sense, I think you look at the Braves lineup and what they've been able to do. Their young core is younger than the Mets. And those guys are homegrown. They locked them all up before they really got to that superstar status. So they got some of those guys for cheap or cheaper, I should say, than if they hit the open market in terms of Acuna and everybody else they have over there. So I think program wise, you look at the Braves, as much as we hate to admit it, as kind of an example of how to really grow and develop homegrown talent.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple different directions they could go that would lead the culture one way or another. But I mean, Juan Soto, is there a better guy you can think of off the top of your head who would come in and just add and like the Mets do have space for someone like him to come in and change and lead the culture there. So I like it. I wanted to ask you guys if you've heard about this because it's certainly before your time, but I just found this fun fact as we move into the late 70s, early 80s here. In 1979, the Mets enlisted a mule to take some, quote, laboriously slow trots along the foul lines. I guess there was a fan contest to name this mule, and they named him Metal. According to the winner, Dolores Maps, she chose the name because Metal exemplified their strength, stamina, and courage. In a clear violation of team spirit, they finished in last place that year and they averaged only 10,000 fans per game. Metal was, I guess, held partially responsible for this because she was put out to pasture by 1980. Have you heard about this mule?
I have never heard of that.
I have never heard of that, but that's fascinating. Awesome.
That was like the origin of LOL Mets, right? That was the first one.
Yeah, is that maybe? Yeah, that's where it all started.
But listen, what we can say is that I do feel like that whole idea of LOL Mets, which you just see getting thrown around a lot. I feel like Ashley and I have said this in the past where it's like, obviously our whole title in a way was built the way it was because we sort of knew that the Mets are going to have some disappointing weeks and we want to still be able to talk about that as a point of excitement or maybe just even connection or community. Mm-hmm. But I do feel like that is a running theme, is that every single week we never run out of things to talk about because something strange is happening that has nothing or very little to do with baseball.
Yeah, the Mets are, I think, franchise-wise across Major League Baseball, one of the most I'm biased, but interesting and unique. There's always something happening. It can err on the embarrassing LOL Mets side of things when you got a pitcher getting designated for assignment because he's throwing his glove and, making post-game comments on the team. But even when things are going well, there's always just some unique, funny things happening with the Mets.
Yeah. Plus, I don't know if everybody across the nation would feel this way. I think a lot of people would. I think the broadcast booth is a part of it. I think people know Gary, Heath, and Ron as broadcasters who are just well known across the baseball field. I feel like there's even funny things that happens with that. Like just the most recent example I can think of is that thing with the math and the jerseys.
Oh my God.
Did I send you that?
Yeah.
Where Heath, I don't know if you saw that on Twitter anywhere.
No.
Kelsey, basically Gary was they were showing a picture of the back of 2 jerseys. Do you remember whose jerseys it was?
It was Keith's. It was 17.
It was Keith, and then who else?
Somebody that was 8.
Right. And Keith said, like, just out of nowhere, Keith goes, like, literally in complete seriousness, 17 and 8. He's like, yep. He's like, and that adds up to 15, right? And Gary's like, Keith, what adds up to 15?
Yeah.
And then he's like, that adds up to 25. And like, they're just like dying laughing. It's just like, and then it just, of course, just getting thrown all around Twitter. I can't, just like things like that, you know, that kind of adds to the experience, at least for us.
Yeah, we think they're one of the best broadcast booths in baseball. I would say both of us were kind of heavily influenced by growing up watching them, you know, as to wanting to get into sports broadcasting. And of course, Keith Hernandez, a former Cardinal. So we love the SNY broadcast every night.
I mean, there's a certain amount of camaraderie that you're going to build going through the ups and downs and the twists and turns that a franchise like the Mets is going to give you. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. And let's get into a little the background of Keith Hernandez and how he came to the Mets, because first in 1980, in January, the Mets were sold to a group headed by Nelson Doubleday and Fred Wilpon. The purchase price is an estimated $21.1 million at the time, which was the highest amount ever paid for an American professional sports franchise, which I thought was interesting. And in 1983 is when former National League MVP and perennial Gold Glove winner Keith Hernandez was obtained by the Mets from the St. Louis Cardinals. This began a rivalry between the two teams that lasted through the rest of the 1980s. During this time, the teams would swap who was winning the title for the division. So that was certainly a big part of it as well, between 85 and 88. And Mets players openly trolled the Cardinals, and the Cardinals fans nicknamed the Mets Pond Scum. Now, I knew the Mets were pond scum before I knew why the Mets were pond scum growing up a Cardinals fan. And obviously all of this happened before any of us were born. But my question for you is, do Mets fans still hate the Cardinals?
I think older Mets fans. That's one of those rivalries that my dad, who is 55, will, you know, he will always have that Cardinals thing. He'll always, when we're ranking and I'm like the Phillies and the Braves and the Yankees, and he'll be like, and the Cardinals. And personally, being younger, of course, 2006, Carlos Beltran, the NLCS, all of that was just when we were, you know, getting into Mets fandom. But I think in the last 20 or so years, definitely hasn't been as much of a heated rivalry. But I would say those older fans, those 40 and above fans, definitely still, you know, will always hold the Cardinals as rivals.
Yeah, ditto. She hit the nail on the head with that. I agree.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk about like how fandom and rivalries has evolved from generation to generation, because there are definitely people in Mets fandom, depending on your age, who will be like, these are our biggest rivals. And then you're like, are they though? Like, I just don't feel that. So that reads. Well, in 1986, the Mets won the pennant for the first time since 1973. They went on to win their second World Series title over Boston, and this is their most recent World Series title. So they currently have the 8th longest title drought with 37 seasons. In the early 90s, the Mets tried to rebuild by spending loads of money on experienced free agents, but it backfired big time for a multitude of reasons. It was a few years of PR nightmare, and the Mets were reportedly the worst team money can buy during this time. Which brings me to what's kind of happening today. In the past few seasons, we have seen the Mets take an all-in approach in terms of payroll and signing experienced free agents in the quest to be a serious contender. So they did something similar to this in the 90s, and it all backfired. Is this history repeating itself, or what do you see that might be different about this mistake that the franchise has already made?
I think part of the issue when you're looking at that like 1992 year that you're talking about, and the worst team money can buy, is that a lot of the players on that team really had a bad attitude. Like you mentioned the PR nightmare, but like some of these guys and some of the things they were doing and some of the behavioral problems and the issues off the field were a PR nightmare, and it made them a little bit unlikable. There were issues in the clubhouse, off the field, issues with the team from a culture standpoint. And it definitely makes you realize, which this is something we talk about, that money is not everything. Now, fast forward to right now, it's the same in the fact that you have a veteran team that stinks. They're not, again, in win now mode, which I think was the idea, at least last season, is, you know, Steve Cohen saying, this is what we're going to try for. And it didn't work. And they're also not, at least right now, necessarily building for the future. So they're sort of in limbo. But I think the difference with a team like the one you're seeing this year versus that team that you're referencing is that there are still at least in my opinion, some quality clubhouse guys. It's not to say that there are no culture issues. That's actually something we discussed on our most recent episode. There are a couple of guys like McNeil, potentially even Alonso, where we're just not exactly sure where things stand, where you're seeing them missing from some pictures or whatever the situation is. But there are still some guys on there where I still think that there would be some Mets fans who could tell you maybe there's some time to turn things around. But if I had to put my money on what I really thought was going to happen, I think ultimately this season ends up being sort of a wash. It would not surprise me to see that they do sell Pete Alonso. And then I think they do decide, all right, the win now model didn't work. We're going to try to do something else and maybe build a younger core, because it just can't continue on the way that it is right now.
I think what's lacking from this year's team more than anything, and we've discussed this a bunch, is just a clear-cut leader. Francisco Lindor has really taken that, I guess, captain-esque role. But you look at Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil, Pete Alonso, those are three homegrown guys who have been on this team for 5+ years. I know there's been a lot of discussion among Mets fans. If Pete Alonso does get re-signed long-term, does he get that C on his chest? Does he deserve that captain label? In my opinion, those three, Nimmo, McNeil, and Alonso, are just not natural born leaders. That's okay. That's not to say that they suck baseball fields and that's everything. Like, that's okay. Some people are just not cut out for that. Francisco Lindor is more of that natural voice in the room. And of course, he's signed long-term too. So that works. But I just think since David Wright, who was the last captain for the Mets formally, and since kind of that era 5-10 years ago, they haven't had that clear cut, he's going to discipline you. I don't know if you remember this, but like David Wright, known for being such a stand-up guy, great ambassador for the Mets throughout baseball, did a lot of charity work, just a great representative of the organization. But he took over that role. He threw out Noah Syndergaard's lunch when Noah Syndergaard was coming up in spring training, and he was like, why are you eating lunch right now? Like, threw it out. It made headlines. He was just the guy that people respected and I guess wanted to play for him, even in those years when there were David Wright years where the Mets were terrible. They were unwatchable, but you knew that he was going to hold them to some kind of standard. And this is a long-winded way of saying I think they've kind of been missing that voice ever since.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point to bring up. The Cardinals have had similar conversations around their clubhouse culture recently as well, and have tried to make moves to kind of offset that. But I love how the point that you made that sometimes, especially as fans, we try to force these guys to be someone that they're not. And yeah, there really is no expectation for Jeff McNeil or Pete Alonso to be the kind of culture guy, or, that's not what they're paid or what they were hired to do. And we have to allow them to be who they are, appreciate them for who they are. Not saying that that's not an important component, but it's not fair to just assume that because they are the big bats or the best players on the team in certain regards, that they're also going to bring that piece. So good call out there. Well, circling back on the end of the 1990s here real quick, the only playoff appearance of the 90s for the Mets was on October 3rd. Melvin Mora scars on a Brad Klontz ninth inning wild pitch to give the Mets a 2-1 win over the Pirates before 50,000 fans, forcing a one-game wildcard playoff the next day in Cincinnati. They ultimately lost in the championship series to the Braves. And this is where I want to touch on kind of the aspect of your podcast, of why it's titled what it is. Because one of the things that you kind of joke about, but you're also very serious about on your show, is how on brand it is for the Mets to get your hopes up. Like, they get into the wild card game in this very dramatic fashion, and seem to have some real baseball magic happening, but ultimately fall short. Is this like an understood thing that for Mets fans to find solidarity in? And how do you stay invested when the team isn't competitive for stretches of time?
I think we touched on this earlier, right? But the Mets, their kind of brand is being those underdogs. So that goes two ways. You expect them to be the underdogs. You might not expect them to win in those high profile situations, but it makes it that much sweeter. And I think also, gets some people who are not traditional Mets fans, right? People love an underdog. People love a lovable loser, which is what the Mets have been branded kind of their whole existence. So I think that the Mets keep you reeled in even when they're bad, just because of, if you grow up on the Mets, there's kind of no way out, right? Like, I always say this, but if you get too deep in and, in high school or in college and you've been raised a Mets fan, I don't think you're leaving that space just because it is such a community. And Kelsey, like you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that does build community. That even us starting this podcast right now, when the Mets aren't very good, well, people want to commiserate and people want to say, oh, a fellow Mets fan that goes through these struggles week in and week out. It's a bonding experience.
Commiserate.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Literally the DNA of Mets fandom is disappointment. It really is. I mean, there's the struggle and the thing about it, I've thought about this a lot recently. I think part of the reason also why you're getting so roped in is because we all really do hate losing. Like everybody who is a Mets fan understands that that's going to happen and sometimes expects it to happen, but it's not a fan base that's complacent with that. Like I do feel like there are certain fan bases, like you're not going to go to a Mets game and the fans will be cheering you on no matter the outcome. Like this is New York. Like people are going to boo you if they do not like your performance. It is not always the easiest place to play. And it's a team that really wants to win, but just can't always get it done. But to Ashley's point, right? It's like, that's, I think, what people joke about the most. It's the toxic relationship. It's the ex that pulls you back in for one more chance. And 10 chances later, your needs are still not being met, but you're too old and too invested
and
to go find a new partner. You're married. I mean, it's like, forget about it. You have kids. Like, you just can't get out of it. And I really do think that that's what happens from generation to generation. There's so much meaning behind it. There's so many people who have been involved in getting you to love it that you just can never really get off the ride. And I don't think that anybody wants to. I think that everybody who is here is here for the long run. If you're a Mets fan, you're likely a Mets fan for life. But that's what makes it so fun to cover a team like this and have a podcast about a team like that.
And I think that's a really important point that Sam made, is that it is New York at the end of the day, right? So there are some smaller market teams that can get away with not being competitive for 10, 20 years and nobody's going to say anything. But at the end of the day, it's New York. It's the biggest market in the country. They have the highest payroll in the majors right now with Steve Cohen. So, those are the things that I think I really do believe the Mets have one of the most invested fan bases in professional sports, not even just in baseball. And I think it's an emotional experience when they are good and when they, finally do figure it all out, those rare years. I hear from people about, 2000 in the Subway Series, making the World Series and playing the Yankees. And then, just in our memories, when Johan Santana throws the first Mets no-hitter, when the Mets are in the World Series in 2015, it's just those moments are, I guess, what Mets fans live for, because they're always chasing those times.
Oh, for sure.
Experience no matter what. You're feeling some kind of emotion when you watch the Mets.
Yeah, the New York point is a great one, because I lived in New York City for years, and my husband and I still talk about it being in Chicago. No shade to Chicago. It's great too. But the competitiveness and just the nature of even any business existing in New York is like, you've got to be up there with the best of the best, or at least be trying to be the best of the best, the way that the Mets see, at least their new ownership, investing in them from like, it might not work out, but they're putting the effort in. And that is something, you're right, that given the market that they're in, it has to be a part of their story. And I have certainly found a whole new level of appreciation, even just from last season with the season that the Cardinals had, for fan bases who are able to stick with their team through thick and thin, because it was just crazy to me how many people were checked out. And the Yankees fans can be the same way as they were last season, of where they're just like, well, if we're not winning, like, I'm not in it. I'm not here for this, or I'll go cheer for another team. And the Mets fans are not those people. They're going to stick by your side. And I think that's very commendable and worth mentioning for sure. Well, let's get more into the 2000s, getting a little bit more up to current day here. This was a fun fact that I came across. Not sure if you've ever heard about it, but Garth Brooks, a country music star, he was college pals with Mets third baseman Robin Ventura. And after finding success as a recording artist, he wanted to go back to his roots, and he joined the Mets spring training in 2000. He went 0 for 17, and the team elected, shockingly, not to add him to their team. And I guess it's been tossed around as maybe just being a PR stunt, but he did also try to get on the Padres in 1999 and the Kansas City Royals in 2004. As Mets fans, have you heard about Garth Brooks's attempt to become a New York Met?
I like wonder if I need to ask my like dad about this. Have you heard about this?
No, I actually have not.
I actually haven't either, but that's really interesting. I actually think my dad is a pretty big Garth Brooks fan.
Yeah.
It's unsurprising to hear about that. It also makes me realize, like, I have to just say, like, I think that this podcast is just a great idea because I do feel like the history is such an important part of it, you know, even the funny moments. So props to you for coming up with this idea because it's cool to sort of take that journey down memory lane.
Well, and who knows, like, how well this was a story or how much it came out in 2000 before, you know, everyone just tweeted out things like this. So it may not be as much of common knowledge as it would be these days. You mentioned it, Ashley, that in 2000, the Mets made it back to the World Series, but they lost to the Yankees 4-1. But how cool that there was a Subway Series World Series. I hope we get one of those again in our day because, or I mean, you know, when we're a little older to maybe remember it and appreciate it more. But in 2006, the Mets made it back to the playoffs. They beat the Dodgers in the division series, but they fall to the Cardinals in a highly competitive 7-game NLCS. This is, I guess, when Adam Wainwright becomes public enemy number one to the Mets, or is it Yadier Molina? Do Mets fans hate Adam Wainwright or Yadier Molina more? Because Yadi is the one who actually got the hit that won the game, but Waino is the one that struck out Carlos Beltran.
I would go Wainwright.
I
really? Okay.
Definitely.
I think when the Mets then faced Wainwright, you know, and all the years after that, it was always a big deal when Adam Wainwright was pitching against the Mets in a game in April. Mets fans would be upset to see Wainwright on the mound.
Yeah, for some, I just feel like the strikeout component of it. It was just even now when we were even doing our promos and stuff like that, I feel like that's something that we talk about as just an important moment in the history.
Yeah, every fan base has those moments that they never forget, good or bad, and that's one of those awful moments, I guess, in Mets fandom that people never forget.
Yeah, Waino has recently joined the broadcast team at Fox, and the first game that he did was a Mets game, and he was like, wow, they're just really going to throw me into the fire here, but nothing like it. Then he's had to do a couple Cubs games, so they're just throwing him right into the deep end. Well, in November 13th of 2006, at the ceremonial groundbreaking for their new ballpark, the Mets announced an exclusive 20-year multifaceted strategic marketing and business partnership with Citigroup, including the naming rights for Citi Field. I have gotten to attend games at Citi Field a number of times. It's been probably almost 10 years now, but tell us about the Citi Field experience, and are there still big plans in the works for the surrounding area of Citi Field?
Yes, ma'am, there are. Right now, at least as far as I have heard, and I believe all this is still in the works, I believe it's an $8 billion plan. It's going to include a hotel. If they have it their way, it's going to have a casino. There's going to be playgrounds. It's going to be, I think, again, just back to that whole building and experience, building a little bit more community. I also saw that it is estimated to put 15,000 people to work, which I actually think is pretty cool.
Wow.
Like, I can't believe the amount of just the influence that Steve Cohen can have and the amount of jobs that will generate. Like, to me, just from a even like news reporting standpoint, I was like, wow, that's impressive and that's exciting that so many people will get to be a part of that. But yeah, I think there's going to be bars, restaurants, bike paths. I think that it's supposed to make it a little bit more walkable. And I thought the idea of even like a hotel, like, it's also interesting because let's just say you are visiting from somewhere and you're not, you know, living there locally. I mean, even me being from Long Island, like the idea of there being like a hotel there and making that into some kind of an overnight stay or a trip, that really, like, that excites me. I would totally do that, you know, if I knew that I could, and we'll see what ends up happening. But like, to gamble there and to kind of make a whole day out of it or an experience, I think it just ultimately goes to show that, again, Steve Cohen, man, like you really can't hate him, even if, and I think most people really do like him as an owner, even though the on-field product right now is not what you want to see. And at the end of the day, that's ultimately what's going to generate the revenue and the fans. And that's what people want the most. I really feel kind of lucky. I feel so lucky that we have an owner who is legitimately just a diehard fan and would, you know, pour in piles and piles of money, even after seeing the Mets fail, just because he wants to make this organization better and more well-respected.
Yeah, I agree. I actually do. I believe the proposal hit a hitch very recently, within the last couple of
Yeah.
days legally. I don't think it, is dead or shot
Mhm.
down or anything, but I don't know the exact details. I'm not a news reporter, but I think that the proposal hit a little bit of a bump in the road. I would love to see it come to life. As Sam was saying, I grew up mainly outside of Philadelphia. So a trip to Citi Field for me was a 2-hour each way
Right.
event. And I think that then, right, you go to the game and then you go to dinner or you do whatever else you're going to do for the day. You probably go over to Manhattan. So I would love to see that area in Flushing and, in Queens get a little bit more developed so it can be more of a game day experience. Right there. But Citi Fields, as far as if people have never been, beautiful ballpark. I rank it, within the top 10 in baseball, right? You have those legendary, iconic ones, but I would just say game day experience wise, the food, the atmosphere, the in-game, stuff is, I would say top 10. And I think they do a really good job in the Jackie Robinson Rotunda, which is right when you walk into Citi Field. They have the Mets Hall of Fame and a bunch of sentiments that honor, like we were talking about earlier, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Giants and kind of their heritage. So I always think that's really cool and really unique when I go to Citi Field.
Yeah, no doubt. It's very, like, even just from a visual standpoint. I mean, they even have now the bigger board. It really does. It feels like an experience. The light show when Edwin Diaz was doing better. They, like, everything there in a sense, it does. It feels like an experience. And I should have made that clear, but I'm happy Ashley brought that up. It is definitely still in the proposal phase.
Yeah.
So we'll see what ends up in the works. But I just thought what they laid out was very interesting and a lot of money to be investing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking when you were first talking about it, was how, because even here in Chicago, there is a hotel now around in Wrigleyville, but people still mostly, when they come to town, they stay downtown, which is nowhere near Wrigleyville, and it's not really supporting the community that the stadium is actually in. And that's so true for where Citi Field is at. And you make such a great point of how big these sports teams are for the communities that they're in, and how cool it would be to see the New York Mets invest more in Queens specifically and in that area that they're in. So yeah, I look forward to seeing some more progress with that. But Citi Field opened in 2009. I completely agree. I've had nothing but great experiences there. It's beautiful. Don't tell anyone, but I do like it more than Yankee Stadium. It's a little more spread out. It's a little easier to navigate. It's newer, it's nicer. But in 2015, the Mets had their first playoff berth since 2006, winning the division. They then upended the Dodgers in 5 games in the National League Division Series. They swept the Cubs. We love to see it, in the NL Championship Series to win their first pennant since 2000. Unfortunately, the Magic ended just short of a World Series title when they lost in 5 games to the Royals. In 2016, it was actually the second time in franchise history that they made the playoffs in consecutive years, but they lost to none other than Madison Bumgarner and the Giants in the wild card. Getting into the current days, January 16th, 2020, Carlos Beltran stepped down as manager before ever managing a game due to his involvement in the Houston Astros sign stealing scandal. So if you're a newer baseball fan or a younger baseball fan, these might be like the things that you know about the Mets. And we've set a lot of groundwork leading up to it. But 2 days later, the Mets hired Luis Rojas as manager. The team finished the shortened 2020 season with a 26-34 record as a last place finish in the NL East. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, maybe, because here comes Uncle Steve Cohen. On October 30th of 2020, Steve Cohen becomes the majority owner of the Mets. He owns 95% of the team, and that makes him the current richest owner in baseball. As you have mentioned, he has very openly declared that his goal is to get his team, that he is truly a deep, lifelong fan of, a World Series championship in the first 5 years of his tenure. We are currently in year 4. And I took a peek here because Major League Baseball finalized its payroll figures for last year, and the Mets finished at a record $319.5 million. In addition to the payroll, they paid a record luxury tax of $100.8 million, and they finished, of course, 4th in the NL East at 75-87, 29 games behind the first place Atlanta Braves and 9 games back of the last wild card berth. So New York spending would have been even higher if they didn't trade away Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander, and David Robertson, among other veterans. I want to know how you guys felt about the team coming into 2023. Did you have high expectations? Were you excited?
I would say going into last season, yeah, they're coming off that wild card series in 2022, right? They lose to the Padres, but it's like, all right, Steve Cohen, just kind of bought this team and we're making the playoffs, step in the right direction. An underperforming season last year. I think last year is what took a lot of people by surprise. You have this young core in their prime. You have, at the time, beginning 2023, you still have Jacob deGrom, you still have Max Scherzer. So I think that last year was really the beginning of this transition into now, which we've touched on our podcast a lot. Now, is it time for the rebuild, right? You mentioned, Kelsey, Steve Cohen buys the team in the fall of 2020, and they're not in a good spot. The Wilpons left them, not only financially in having problems, but also the farm system was depleted. The organization as a whole was not in a good place when Steve Cohen bought the team. He tries to win now. He basically, he has the money. The guy's a billionaire. So he basically buys the best free agents money can buy. He locks up Lindor. He re-signs Edwin Diaz. He brings in Starling Marte. He, the whole 9 yards, gets Scherzer, etc. And it didn't work. And now we have nothing to show for it in year 4. And I think that's what Mets fans are coming to the conclusion of now is, what do we do? Because we tried the win now angle and it didn't work. I don't blame Steve Cohen for trying the win now angle, because back in 2020 really didn't have much of another option, right? They hadn't been good at that point since 2016. It had been 4 or 5 years. If you ask fans to wait another 4 or 5 years, that wouldn't have gone over so well. So now we're 4 years into this experiment, and I think it's going to be interesting, quite frankly, to see what direction we take, and that they take. And that's not something that we know. That's not something, I don't even know if they know yet. It'll really come down to this year's deadline and this year's off season. If they do wrap up this season and the direction that they're going continues, and they're sellers at the deadline, and all of a sudden you have no more Pete Alonso and no more, whoever else gets sold off, it will be interesting to see if we go into full rebuild mode here or expedited rebuilds. Cohen and Stearns saying even before this season, really look more towards 2025. I think they're excited about some of those pieces down on the farm. So it is a transitional time, to say the least.
To say the least. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think something that we talk about a lot is that no one blamed Cohen for trying the win now strategy. I actually think when it was happening, everybody thought this is the greatest thing ever.
Oh, yeah.
This guy, this is a fantastic idea. And again, it did show you that sometimes money just can't buy everything, and it can't buy wins, and it can't buy success. But I appreciated that he tried that. I thought it made sense at the time. You don't always know exactly how things are going to work out. I guess what I will say about this year is the more losses I see, the more I feel like some of these guys got to go, which is a sad thing to say, because I think a lot of people would tell you that they really do like a lot of members of this core, like Pete Alonso, like that's a guy where, I don't know, I think in the past, I probably thought he was always going to be around and always going to be a Met. And now I'm just not so sure. But there's only so many things that you can do. They have to look in a certain direction here. They're still in limbo right now. Like, honestly, even to Ashley's point, I don't think that they know exactly what they're going to do. I think all of those decisions are still being made now and are still at least somewhat dependent on how the next month plus goes. I mean, honestly, like I'm sure he didn't do it. I know there's a lot of pressure, but like if I'm Steve Cohen, I'm thinking in my head, of like, I would even walk down and tell these guys, like, listen, the way that you play for the next month, you had like convince me that I should keep you, convince me that we should stay with this. Although, and this is another thing I thought about, there might be some guys who are happy to go. I hate to say it, but you don't even always know who wants to stay. Yeah. And that's another important factor.
I will say, I think from a Mets fan perspective, the difference in having Steve Cohen as your owner and the team being bad is still a world of a difference between having the Wilpons as your owner and the team being bad. Because even like I said, if they enter rebuild mode, I still feel confident that it's not going to be a traditional rebuild in the sense of we're spending no money, we're focusing on the farm for 5 years. They could enter rebuild and Steve Cohen could still go out and get Juan Soto. So I just think the potential is so much higher with Cohen as the owner, and he's shown a willingness to eat money. Like, we talk about this on our podcast a lot, but he's just not complacent. Omar Narvaez was just designated for assignment last week. He was owed millions on the books. There was other people this year, I believe Joey Wendell, right? There's been other, not huge amounts of money, but couple million here, couple million there. If you're not cutting it, Steve Cohen, you're out. So that's refreshing, at least from a Mets fan perspective throughout history.
His
that
willingness to eat money. He's a Pac-Man. Like,
Yeah.
literally, he will do whatever it takes.
That we finally have an owner that, is cutthroat and is willing to really do whatever it takes to try to get this team to a better place.
Yeah, I mean, you feel like you just have somebody on your side, another fan, like as your owner, which is really cool. From a zoomed out perspective, like I was very critical on him just pouring money into that team. And I was saying even at, before the season even started last season that like money is just not enough. And I think it's great that now he has this added piece. Like he went out and got his man in David Stearns. Has it played out in 2024? No, but it's not going to play out that quickly. And that's something that I think like we all have to be reminded of, not just in baseball, but in life and our government and everything, that sometimes it just takes some time and we got to step back and let things play out. But seeing him bring David Stearns in and add kind of that strategy piece into now his willingness to spend money and cut costs where he needs to, or cut fat where he needs to, it gives you a lot to be excited and hopeful about, even when day-to-day things might not be going exactly the way that you want them to at the moment. Well, one thing that Mets fans have to look forward to, if nothing else this season, is that the Mets are headed to London this weekend. They're going to play in the London series versus the Phillies. And I got to go to the London series last year because my sister lives in London and the Cubs and the Cardinals were playing. So it was a great opportunity for me to get over there and visit her. And I wanted to tell you guys, just wrap things up today with a little fun about these two featured items that are going to be served at London Stadium. This is how the UK celebrates America and how they really view America, and America's favorite pastime is with just complete and utter indulgence. So they are going to feature, among other things, the Boomtown hot dog and the Boomtown nachos. So the Boomtown hot dog is a 2-foot-long hot dog that is loaded with braised beef and chili. It is topped with jalapenos, nacho cheese, and sour cream. Now, I will say the nacho cheese is not the kind of like ballpark nacho cheese you would get here, because it's not real food. So they don't serve it in the UK because they have different kind of regulations around serving not real food there, but they do it. It has the cheese, it's got the sour cream. It is designed to be shared between 4 friends, but really enjoy it however you like. Along with that, the Boomtown nachos, just like the hot dog, it is a 2-foot serving of tortilla chips topped with a generous helping of cheese, chili, jalapeno peppers, sour cream, spring onions, and salsa. Sam, are you going to town on the hot dog or the nachos?
Oh, the hot dog, and it's not even close. And it's funny because when you were saying that and you're talking about designed to be split between 4 people, like give me the shot on the SNY broadcast of the man who is just downing that by himself. Yeah. Because like he's in the stadium somewhere and the production crew will find him. I'm gonna go hot dog on that, but also because you said they have some. I feel like you mentioned a couple spicy things that are on that too, right? I'm a spicy girl, so that's right up my alley. And I'm feeling like you're going to say the nachos, but I could be wrong.
100% the nachos.
Okay. How did you know? Just know.
I love a good, not like a pulled pork nacho or anything like that is so up my alley. So definitely going nachos. You said it was 2 feet worth of nachos. I'd like to know how that's measured. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So my mom actually got this last year when we were there, and she got it, in like the 8th inning of the game. And we're like, she comes back, she's like, everybody's got to help me eat this. And we're like,
so mom.
That's such a mom thing to do in the 8th inning too. Yeah. We can do it.
Yeah.
Got to get all the experiences in, all the photo ops. Well, ladies, thank you so much for hanging out with me today and giving us just a peek behind the curtain of Mets fandom. Tell our listeners where they can find you and your podcast.
Yeah, so we are on social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and the handle is the same at @WhyMetsPod. You can find our actual podcast wherever you listen to or get your podcast, but we also have our YouTube channel at @WhyMetsPod. So if you would prefer to watch, this is actually the studio we do it in. You can see the background behind us. If you prefer to listen, we don't discriminate. So that is where you can find us at @WhyMetsPod on any platform pretty much.
Yep. New episodes out every Monday that's our episode of the week with our takes and our, latest hot topics regarding the Mets, and then is also the Syracuse Mets. But we also, we've done one, but we're hoping to do many more extra innings episodes with guests coming on the podcast, either Syracuse Mets players or just people surrounding the organization, broadcasters, other people that we know throughout our field that follow the Mets. So we're excited to expand on that as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I was gonna, sometimes on these episodes, I ask more about like, what players are you excited about that might be up and coming in the organization, but you are covering all of that on your podcast, and that is a great reason for people to head over and get everything else they could possibly want to know about the Mets straight from the source. So thank you so much again for joining me today, and we'll link all of that in the show notes for our listeners. And enjoy the rest of the season as much as you can. I know that if Mets fans are looking for a way to stick with them, they have you guys over there in solidarity. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the season.
Thanks for having us.